Thank you so very much, Dennis. Go ahead and open your Bibles. We are going to start by just reading a passage out of Galatians. Let me get to that myself here. Let's just start by reading Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8. Probably pretty familiar language to you. Here, Paul says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of his flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life." I'd like to set this up by kind of doing a little bit longer intro than maybe I normally do. In the not too distant future, we're going to be having a gospel meeting in which we're going to deal primarily with the topic of, what is the goodness of the gospel? What is the real benefit that we gain from the gospel? How does it help us? And that's kind of what this lesson is aimed at this morning, to kind of talk about that. I think that's vitally important because of the potential in understanding the benefit of the gospel. What's so good about the good news? And when we really understand that and think about that, I think it helps us so that we can reach out to those who don't really, know much about the Bible, or perhaps who are misinformed about the Bible. I think there's lots of folks who perhaps think they know something about the Bible, think they know something about Christianity, but very often they're mistaken in that regard. They're misinformed. There are lots of these kinds of people. Some of them are kind of belligerent. Have you ever run into that belligerent person that seems to really have a chip on their shoulder about God and about the Bible? But, most folks aren't really belligerent. That's really not the issue with them. Even though across the board, church attendance is way down all across America, really in Western culture, church attendance is way down. But even so, the number holds steady for the number of people in the general population who say they believe in God, or at least some form of God, some kind of higher power. That's holding steady at 80%. That's for generations. That's been about what the polls have demonstrated. About 80% of the population claims to believe in God, or as they say, at least some form of a higher power. So you'd think that if 80% of the population is accepting of this idea that there is a God, there is a higher power, wouldn't you think that churches would be full? But they're not. So, what's going on there? Well, that's not a real simple question to answer. I think there's probably several reasons. There's several factors for why you see that dichotomy between the numbers of people who claim to believe in God and how many people actually doing something about it, that is showing up in their behavior in making a commitment religiously to attend church, to do something about it. And I think one of the big reasons, and what we're going to really be focusing on this morning, is I think a lot of people just don't see the relevancy of the gospel. They don't see the relevancy of going to church. How is me going to church going to help me deal with my financial problems? How is going to church going to help me deal with the fact that my life is in a mess? How is it that believing in God is going to overcome the fact that my boss at work is a huge jerk? All right. Now, that's what I think the disconnect is for lots of people. I think that's what's going on in the minds of the uninformed and the misinformed is that they don't understand that that's what I do. And it becomes our job then as Christians to connect the dots for people, to show them, hey, look, this gospel stuff, this good news, it's custom made for you. Here's how the gospel will work in your life. Here's how the gospel can help you. What we're doing is we're showing them here's why it's good news. You see that? It's good news. And that's what the people are not seeing. They're not seeing the good news part of it. It's not good news to them. And so that's what this lesson is designed to communicate. It's designed to communicate the good news. And so that's the point, the question that I really want to look at is, well, okay, Gary, why do you think Galatians 6, 7, and 8 is good news? I mean, I remember a time when I got my first car, just graduated from high school, and I got my first car. It was a really neat 66 Chevy Nova, the cool looking car, fire engine red. And I did not take care of that car. My dad would say, Gary, listen, you got to take care of that car. It's gonna, if you don't take care of that, you got to check the oil and check the water and check, just take care of it. Well, I didn't. And guess what? The transmission blew up. And I heard my dad say, Gary, you reap what you sow. And that was not good news to me when I heard that, right? Can you see why? I didn't see that as a particularly positive message. I didn't go, woohoo, my dad, thanks. That's really good news. Okay. So why do I think that this passage that tells us that we reap what we sow is good news? I think there's lots of people that would look at that. I think there's all kinds of guys sitting in jail right now wondering, how I got there. And what do we say to them? Well, fella, you reap what you sow, right? It's usually pretty negative connotation to that. And for lots of people, it doesn't, it had nothing to do with the Bible. That's been understood for so long that it's kind of been co-opted by our culture. And when people say that, they're often not even thinking about the Bible. You reap what you sow. That's just a rule of life, right? So that's the point. Well, we can flip that around and we can begin to understand that it really is good news, because there are lots of people who live their whole life totally out of touch with this reality. And it's kind of like this book I have in my library. I really like to teach on, apologetics and evidences for God. And this one book is called Gravity, True for You, but Not for Me. And it's a book that explains that truth is an absolute. That's the problem that people have, And so the cover of it's really good because it shows a bunch of people standing on the top of the cliff and they're kind of cringing back because one guy's just take a leap off the edge of the cliff. And that's what he's saying. Well, gravity might be true for you, but not for me. Let's go. Woo! Off he goes. Well, he's going to find out, no, gravity's true for him too. See, and that's kind of the disconnect that people are having with this statement here. They live their life totally out of touch with this reality. And they do it, I think they do it largely because they accept Satan's lie that really inverts Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8. And it's a form of that, but they change it, they invert it. And there's lots of people who live their life, no, I reap what other people sow. Okay. And Satan wants you to believe that lie, that your life is the result of other people's actions. In other words, no, you don't reap what you sow, you reap what other people sow. So in Western pop psychiatry, we've kind of accepted this idea that your life is the result of what your mom and dad did to you. See, that's why you are the way. It's their fault that you are the way you are. Or it's the fault of your boss. It's the fault of your spouse. It's the preacher's fault. It's the elder's fault. I could be having a great life if not for the way people drive their cars, right? Satan rejoices when people believe that garbage. But God teaches you differently. What does God say? God says, you know what? That's not the world you live in, my friend. God says in the real world, in the world that I created, in the world that I created to make you live in that world, guess what? You reap what you sow. That's the world God made. And that's the world you live in. And millions, if not billions of people are living in denial of that truth. And it's really a good truth, you see. It's really important. And that's what we need to understand. That's what this verse is saying. Contrary to popular belief, you do not reap what others sow. That's not the world God made. That's like denying gravity. That's like saying, well, gravity might be true for you, but that's not true for me. Well, you're going to find out it is. And you're probably going to find out the hard way. You're going to find out a way that brings a lot of pain and discomfort to you. Now, that's not to say that what other people do have no impact in your life, because it will. The actions of others can have a potential impact. But here's what God is saying. God is saying, but it's not enough to alter your harvest. It's not, it'll affect you, but the overall effect is not going to change what you end up harvesting in your life. All right. And that's part of the good news. Isn't it nice to know that what you're going to end up harvesting in your life cannot be altered by anyone else but who? But you, as far as the overall harvest is concerned. And that to me is really, that's good news, right? Because we live in a world where we think, well, it's that politician back there in Washington, D.C. They're the one that's messing up my life. And they're the one that's going to alter my harvest. And God says, no, that's not really true. Not in the world I made. That might be in your make-believe world, the world that you have in your own head. That might be how you think, but that's not how it works. The good news is that the actions of others, while they can be impactful upon you, it's not to the degree that it's going to alter your harvest. And that's good news. And here's another thing that is really, really good news about what Galatians is saying here, what Paul is saying here in Galatians is that if you are in a position where you don't like the harvest of your life, you don't like the fruit that you're getting right now, the fruit is bitter. The fruit doesn't taste good to you right now. Guess what? You know how to change that? Start planting different seed, my friend. And that's what Jesus says. It's just as simple as that. If you don't like your harvest, change what you sow. It doesn't say change what the other guy sows. See, it says change what you sow, because you reap what? What do you reap? You reap what you sow. And I'm telling you, that's really good news, because you are in charge of your life. And to me, that's wonderful when you think about that. It's empowering. For instance, Jesus points out that you live in a reality in which nobody can prevent you from going to heaven when you die. Did you know that's the reality you live in? That's the world you live in. You live in a world where if you want to go to heaven when you die, guess what? Nobody can do about that. Nobody can take it away from you. Nobody can alter that. You are 100% in control. Jesus puts you in control. Now, admittedly, that's scary to some people because they like putting the responsibility off on other people. You see, for some people, it's not comfortable to have to accept primary responsibility for their life. But I'm going to tell you something, that's totally up to you. You know, it's totally up to you whether you let that scare you or you choose to recognize that's really good news. And the wonderful thing about it is, and what we'll look at in the rest of the time that we have this morning, is just one of the ways. Now, there's lots of ways Jesus will teach us how we can accept that primary responsibility and why accepting that primary responsibility really is good news. We're just going to look at one of them. There's tons of them. So the question is how? How do we do this? If I don't like the harvest of my life, how do I change what I sow? We're just going to look at one of the ways that Jesus spends his entire ministry talking a lot about how you can do this. Okay, we're just going to look at one of them. And we'll call this being proactive. And as we go through, I'll explain more what I mean by that. A good example of a proactive response. How do you respond? And again, it's not denying that the actions of others and even just the general circumstances of life, it's not saying that they don't have an impact on you. They do. Okay. But what Jesus comes along and teaches us is the trick here is how you choose to respond to those people. How do you choose to respond to those circumstances, to the impactful things that happen to you in your life? And Matthew 5:40, you don't even have to be, most people who really know very little about the Bible know that Jesus said this. Matthew 5:43 and 44. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. You ever heard that before? I would dare say that the majority of Americans have heard that before. Love your enemies. People who've never cracked a Bible in their life know that Jesus said that, right? Do we understand the power of that statement? Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. And what Jesus is saying, this is part of what it means to be proactive, is that my enemy, who I think would be at the top of my list, who I'm going to say can have a potential impact on my life, right? Your enemy and your enemy. Be very broad about how you see your enemy. It's not just a person. It could be a thing. It could be something that you're afraid of. It could be some looming issue that's out there in the future that's really scary to you. And you're really struggling with dealing with that right now. It could be the loss of a loved one. It could be anything. That's your enemy. And this, what Jesus is saying is that your enemy is not responsible for how you choose to respond to them or it or whatever it might be. We typically think our enemies do control how we act, how we think, that it is all up to that crazy politician or that nutball in North Korea. Okay? And Jesus is saying, you know what? That's not the world that I made. It's not how the world works. And so that's what we need to understand. The world typically responds in what are called reactive, not proactive, reactive. The way of the world is to typically respond to a perceived enemy in ways that are classified as reactive. What do I mean by that? Well, it's after the fact. It's a response after the fact. The action, if any action at all, is merely reactive. Oftentimes it's in kind. Okay. Somebody responds to you in the way that the world says you react to that is respond how? Respond back how? With violence, right? And you actually up it a little, right? He punches you in the nose, you punch him in the nose, and you stomp on his toe. See, that's reactive. Okay. They cuss at you. What do you do back? You cuss back at them. See, so it's typically in kind. That's a reactive response. Another very common reactive response might be, we might think of it as the opposite. It really isn't the opposite, but very common, and that is to don't do anything. That's a reactive response. Well, not exactly anything. You sulk about it. You pout. You complain. That's really a big part of a reactive response. You go to other people. People are not associated with whatever the issue is. You don't do this to your enemy. You go to other people and you complain about your enemy to other people. That's what you do. You complain about your boss. You complain about people at church. That's what you do. That's a reactive response. And the most important, if you really want to get into this reactive responding to your enemies or to your threats or whatever you see, the most important is feel sorry for yourself. That's the number one strategy that the world teaches people to do. Okay. Is to feel sorry for yourself. And that's reactive. Stephen Covey wrote a bestseller book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he calls that kind of response, sulking, complaining, feeling sorry for yourself, or just, again, reacting back in kind. You meet violence with violence. You meet bad language with the bad language. You respond to anger with anger. He calls that's what he says, that's reactive behavior. That's a reactive response. He goes on to point out reactive people are seldom very successful people. He points out in the book, 7 Habits of, I have this book, it's really a good book, by the way. He points out that successful people have a different way of acting. And you know what he calls that? Proactive. A different way of responding. And basically, what he's saying is what Jesus taught. Stephen Covey, who wrote that book 20, 30 years ago, is not the guy that figured this out. You know who figured this out? A guy that taught 2,000 years before Mr. Covey was even born. And his name is Jesus Christ. And he's teaching it right there in Matthew 5, verses 43 and 44. That's a proactive response. He's saying your enemy is not responsible for how you choose to respond to them. That's proactive. Okay. And Jesus is teaching you this, that you disconnect how you act from the way other people act. That your behaviors are not based on what other people do. Okay, that's really important. And that's good news to understand that I don't have to act the way that or I'm not giving control of my life to my enemies, to the bad people and the terrible things that might very well be happening in my life. And so that's what Jesus is saying. That's a proactive response. Jesus is teaching this in Matthew 5. And this is just one of the tools. There's lots of other tools that Jesus will teach you how to do this. And it's not just in how we act, it's even how we think. Look in Philippians 4 at verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. This is proactive thinking. He's saying, you know what? Fill your mind with what kind of thoughts? Well, fill your mind with bad thoughts. Fill your mind with things that are awful. Think about the worst possible future that could ever happen to you and just ruminate on that. Just like a cow chewing her cud, just chew on it and chew on it and chew on it. Paul says, what about that? Don't do it. Now, the world does that. Lots of Christians I know do that. But Paul says, don't do that. So it's not just how you act, it goes to how you think, you see. And, well, how can I change how I think? Well, you change how you think by what you're putting in your brain. You don't like the harvest? Change what? Change what you sow. Start sowing good thoughts in there. The world is full of, the example I always use, we don't have a little dog. We're probably going to have a little dog because Minnie always looks at me with those puppy eyes. So we're probably going to get a dog here sometime. And that's the thing I like about dogs. I can have a terrible, no good, rotten day. And I come home and the little dog, Gary's home. Oh man, Gary's home. Isn't that the way the little dog acts? And that's so cool, isn't it? See, that dog knows what world he lives in, or she. I live in a world that God made. And God made that world good. Now, it gets messed up by a lot of things. Sin messes it up. But that doesn't take away the good things that are happening, like when Gary comes home. That's kind of cool to think about. When Gary comes home, that's a good deal. That's a good thing. See? And that's what you can fill your mind with if you want to. There's lots of good things out there. The sun is shining today. Lots of good things out there now. Well, lots of beautiful things out there in the world. And that's what Paul says. You can do that too, if you want to. That's proactive thinking. And I'll throw this extra one in for free. Here's not allowing, proactive thinking is not allowing others to dictate how I think. See also 4:6, you go up a little bit before that. Philippians 4:6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. That's, again, that really belongs to the first point because that's proactive behavior. That's proactive action. Engage in prayer and make sure your prayer contains what? Thanksgiving. Start practicing gratitude. You will be amazed what gratitude will do to your life, how it will change your harvest, how it will change. Because you know why it'll do that? Because you live in a world your God made. And your God made the world you live in which you will reap what you sow. You will. Praise be to God that he made such a world for me, in spite of sin, in spite of all the unfair. There are unfair things. There are awful, terrible things going on out there in that world. But in spite of all that, God made a world in which you are in control of your life. You can act however you want to act. You can choose to think whatever you want to think about. And for lots of people, that's bad news. But Jesus will say, hey, you stick around me and I'll teach you how to turn that into good news. How you can take that and turn it into something good that will make your life, give you a life now worth living, and give you a hope of eternal life where you won't have any of those negative impacts coming at you. You won't have any enemies that you have to pray for. You'll have the perfection of heaven. Does that sound interesting to you? Does that sound like something that you could explain to a friend, to a coworker? Why are you a Christian? What is it that you do? How come you go to church? Well, one of the reasons I go to church is because I've come to understand that I live in a world that I reap what I sow. And I used to think that was bad. But I've been hanging around Jesus enough, and he's actually flipped the script for me. He's actually shown me how that's a good thing, that I'm in control, that I don't have to let the crazy things that people do dictate how I choose to act anymore. I used to do that. I used to do that. I don't do that anymore. And you know who taught me not to do that? I just hang around Jesus. I just hang around other good people that are trying to practice that. Now, they're not perfect. They make mistakes just like even after becoming Christian. I'm still not perfect. I still make mistakes. But you know what? We're closer to getting it figured out. I live in a world in which I understand that I reap what I sow. And I've come to see that that's good news. It really is good news because it empowers me and allows me to live a life worth living. If you're ready to start that life, you can come forward this morning, hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. You can begin that journey today because you reap what you sow. You may have already become a member. You're already on that journey, but you understand, yeah, that's true. I do reap what I sow, and I need to change what I've been harvesting lately. Not right. But as a Christian, I know I can. I can change what I sow. I can repent of my sin, and I know that God will forgive me. I can also request the prayers of the brethren on my behalf that I might be strengthened. So if you're in any way subject to this invitation, come forward, make those wishes known while together we stand and sing.